Thanks to you and to the Lucas Library for hosting us tonight. My name's Craig Knight. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for the Preservation Trust. The San Juan Preservation Trust is a nonprofit, nationally accredited land conservation organization that works here in the San Juan Archipelago. We work with private landowners as well as agency partners to permanently protect land. And you made Turtleback as an example here, but we work with the land bank to protect. I want to thank Megan, my colleague over here, who's actually the one who first made contact with Shawn, and we arranged for a lecture last night at the San Juan Island Library, and so we were pleased to be able to combine it with back-to-back lectures. Shawn is, I'm going to use my cheat sheet. Dr. Shawn Behling is a fur bearer biologist. I didn't know fur bearer was a thing. But...
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I'm in the wildlife division, but because it's also fish and wildlife, we talk about animals in terms of harvesting, unfortunately, and fur bearers are animals that are harvested for their fur. So,
well, I know you come bearing a tiny little bit of fur.
I do.
Show a little later. She's a biologist, ecologist, and plant physiologist, educated at Seattle University, University of Maryland, and University of Washington. While her degrees focus on plant science, it was during her PhD work at UW when she started working with beavers by constructing beaver mitigation devices with an organization called Beavers Northwest, which she'll talk about soon. She learned about the ecology and behavior of these animals and instantly fell in love not just with beavers, but also with spending as much time as possible in waders. She works for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and spends her time overseeing the beaver location project she's going to talk about, as well as some other GIS-based wetland projects. So thank you, Shawn.
Thanks so much, Craig. Hi, everybody. My name is Shawn Behling, and I am so excited to talk to you today about beavers. We're going to cover a little bit of information about beaver biology, and we'll talk a little bit about beaver ecology. Then we'll talk a little bit about beavers and mitigation for the troubles that they sometimes cause landowners. And then we'll move on to talk a little bit about beaver relocation, which is the program that we're currently trying to make law here in the state of Washington. So let's get started. Oh, one more, so sorry, I kind of skipped right over. So let's talk about this animal. Beavers are kind of a curious thing. Depending on where you find them, they can be up to about 90 pounds. I have never seen a 90-pound beaver. I have seen a 70-pound beaver. 70-pound beavers are formidable. And even though 70-pound beavers are slow movers across the landscape, they can still travel far distances. Beavers are really particular about the landscapes that they decide to inhabit. And one of the beavers that I had the pleasure of being introduced to was over in the Methow Valley, and that beaver was placed in a location where we thought that it would thrive. Beavers had other opinions about this on occasion, and this beaver did too. It traveled over 90 miles to go find itself a better location over just a 2-week period, which is an incredible thing. So, 70-ish pound critter, and these 70-ish pound critters are covered in a very luxurious fur. And this fur has 2 different levels. First, there's like this coarse, waterproof exterior, and then this soft, fluffy interior, kind of like some dogs have 2 levels of fur, right? And one of the characteristics of this type of fur is that it can be made into like a woolen sort of fabric that's smoother than wool would be. Yeah, so go on to the next one. And this type of fabric was made into hats around the 1800s. And that fabric was really prized, not just for people who are wearing like Daniel Boone hats. This is not something that folks in cabins are wearing. This is high society. These are very expensive. And because society has so many demands on how those hats might have slight changes over time, you can have a collection of 10 or 20 beaver hats for a single high society woman. So I'm going to pass around a little snippet of fur for you to be able to explore how this works. So the exterior has these long guard hairs that are kind of waterproof. And then if you kind of peel it back, there's this fluffy undercoat. And so the undercoat is what keeps the beaver warm when it is doing its aquatic things. And this coarse outer material is what keeps it waterproof. Now the process of making hats wouldn't involve that coarse outer hair at all. That would be removed. And the soft fluffiness would be made into the hat material. And hats were so popular. I'm going to pass that around. Oh, sorry. Don't feel pressured to touch my samples. It's okay if it's not for you. So the demand of hats was so great that all of the beavers in Europe were quickly completely decimated from that continent. And then over in eastern North America, all of the beavers there were quickly extirpated. And eventually the demand for beavers became so great that all of the beavers, even in western United States, was removed from the landscape. So around 1850, we don't know exactly, but about that time, all of the beavers that we estimate were on the landscape were basically removed from the United States. So beavers, which have such an enormous amount of influence on the landscape, are suddenly no longer present, no longer maintaining their dams, no longer creating channels and wetlands, and you're left with such a dramatically different landscape than what you might have had when they were present on the landscape. So we'll talk more about that in a second, but just note that beavers were completely removed and then slowly have bounced back to be able to repopulate areas like Washington State. Okay, let's go to the next one. So before we talk more about beavers repopulating Washington State, let's talk more about their biology and what makes them special. Oh, when you look at this cute little face, there are a lot of sensory organs that are located at the top of this animal's head. And that's by design. By having eyes, ears, and nose all at the top of the skull, it means that the rest of your incredibly delicious body is submerged and safe from predation, but you can still sense what's going on above the water. So beavers are really strangely shaped. There's a lot of mass, there's a lot of fat, and they'd be very delicious prey for a lot of animals. So some of the major predation species for this animal are going to be cougars. Love beavers, especially on the Olympic Peninsula. Bears are big fans. Coyotes, on occasion dogs. So beavers are going to be a very tasty treat for a lot of carnivores. So making sure that you're submerged and kept out of sight is a great way to make sure that you're going to survive the night. So another thing that I would like to mention when we're thinking about beaver biology is not just that the eyes and ears and nose are at the top of its skull, but in general, when you look at the skull of any animal, the more space that's devoted to a particular sense means that that's the most important of all of the senses for that animal. And I'm going to pass this skull around for you to take a peek at. But one of the things I want you to notice when you're working with this skull is how much space is devoted to the nose. So there's just this enormous amount of space in the rostrum, and there's a lot of these, the bones that are the anchor to the sinuses inside of here. And all of that surface area in there, and all of this space tells you that the sense of smell is hugely important to this critter. That's great, because these animals can be stinky. They have a castoreum gland that's under their tails, in their cloaca, that they use to be able to communicate to other beavers to tell them that this is their territory. So they'll make little scent maps. They'll make these muddy little cones of mud and sticks and goop, and then they will put a little bit of this castoreum on top of it so that it smells like that individual, basically communicating to anybody, anywhere, that this is this beaver's spot. And they're really careful about where they put those little scent mounds. They make sure that they're always going to be wet so that there's going to be this evaporation that brings the scent up into the air. And they also make sure that it's in a space where there's going to be a lot of air movement. So you'll normally see it in a place that's kind of been cleared away from vegetation. So sense of smell, huge for these animals. The other thing that I want you to look at when I pass this skull around is their ridiculously crazy teeth. The front of their teeth are bright orange. And that bright orange color is because there is iron embedded in the enamel, but only on the front of both of those incisors. So, all four of those incisors. So the front of the incisors are orange, but you'll notice that the back of the incisors are still white. It's just regular enamel like yours. And so what's happening there is that because the iron makes that enamel so much more strong than it would be otherwise, every time this animal closes its jaws, these teeth shear past each other like scissors. And it essentially makes sure that the teeth are sharpened with every single bite. And this is really exciting. Could you go 2 more slides, because I have 1 more too. There we go. This is really an important thing to do because these critters have teeth that grow their entire lives long. They are constantly growing. And if they don't shear their teeth this way, then the tooth will curl back around and basically pierce their skull. When there's deformities in the lower jaw, you'll see that that can happen. And beavers aren't really thrilled about that. It means you're not going to be able to eat very efficiently. So keeping your teeth sharp is not only a good way to help make sure that your teeth don't grow back into your skull, but also to make sure that you're always ready to be able to eat more tree material, get to that cambium that will nourish you and also build whatever structure you're excited about building. As you pass this around, you might want to also look at the molars that are at the back of the mouth. These molars are here because they grind up vegetative material. Beavers are exclusively vegetarian. Beavers will never be eating fish. You're never going to be taking a bite out of another beaver for nutrition. These beavers are only going to be eating plant material like rhizomes. A really big fan of lily pads. They really like to eat willows. Sometimes they'll even eat conifers if they really have to, but they definitely have favorite species that they go for. But it'll always be plants. Another thing that I want you to notice is that they do have pretty prominent ears. Hard to see ears when we're looking at a skull, but you can still see where the ears would be. So the ears are these little channels that are at the back of the skull, and those are helping to make sure that even though ears in most animals would be just presented as holes in a mammal skull, because this animal is submerged, it needed a little extra lift to make sure that the ears would be out of the water when the rest of the animal is submerged. So that's why those little protrusions are in the back. Happy to talk more about any of the cool structures in here. You might also see that this guy's had some cavities in its roots. That's what these dark marks are on the lower mandible. So this is a cool specimen. So I'm going to pass that around too. I'll go with this direction. Yeah, no problem. All right, could you go to the next slide? Okay, so let's talk about a couple of the other features that make beavers as fantastic of an aquatic mammal as they are. They have an incredibly weird tail. That tail is highly vascularized and it changes shape over the period of the year. So that tail is filled mostly with fat. There's bones in the middle to help make sure that it's as strong as possible. And there's lots of blood vessels and nerve endings in there. And those tails are doing a lot of things. First, it's storing fat so that during those lean winter months, it has a way to be able to take nutrition in. That tail will also be a communication tool. They'll slap the tail on the surface of the water to tell other beavers, this is my spot. But that tail can also act like a kickstand. So when they are trying to reach branches that are a little out of reach, or maybe they are walking across the landscape holding a rock like a tiny human to place in their dam, they'll use that tail to help support themselves so they don't fall over. So tails are really important. They have a really weird scaly exterior to help make sure that when they do slap it against the surface of the water, that it has a much louder sound than it would if it had been covered in fur, and it's always startling. So if you ever have the opportunity to go hang out under the 520 bridge, which is my favorite place to go look at beavers, after dark, which is always exciting for many reasons, there's always beavers that are hanging out under there, and it's like a party. It's like a sea of beavers. There was one night where I went out and there had to be 20 beavers around my boat just within the pool of light from my headlamp. So they are very gregarious when it's all their own people, when it's their own family. They're just not a big fan of beavers outside of their family. So it's fun times. Okay, so we talked about the fur. We talked about their senses of smell. We've talked a little bit about their teeth. One of the things that we're going to talk about next is how unwieldy they are on land. So when you are underwater, these animals are so graceful. They are slick and sleek, and they move like mercury underwater just as fast as can be. But if they ever need to come out of the water, they've got a lot of clumsiness that just makes them look as awkward as possible. I'm not going to pass these around just in case you're a little turned off by this, but you're welcome to come and look at these later. Their front feet look like little hands, little human hands even. They have individual fingers, they have long nails to help them with a little bit of digging if they need to do it. And each one of those fingers has a really nice comfy pad on the back because they have really weird structures inside of their dens, which we'll talk about in a second. That makes it a little easier to move around. But their back feet are totally different. Their back feet are enormous and webbed and long. And if you had this as your back foot, you would have a hard time moving across the landscape too. So when these critters are walking across land, they're awkward, they're slow, and it would make it very easy for you as a predator to take them down. And because of that, beavers have made a lot of changes to the landscape that they occupy to help make sure that they spend as little time as possible outside of the water. Yeah, if you could go to the next one, that'd be great. So, in order to help make sure that they spend as much time in the water as possible, beavers have constructed or do construct 2 or 3 different types of structures. One structure we're not going to really talk about much, that's a bank den. Basically a hole in the side of a stream bank or next to a lake where they've taken it over from otters or muskrats and made it their own. I'm not going to talk much about that. But the other structures we're going to talk about are their dens. So a beaver den looks like this. You have this structure that's basically surrounded by water, and there are 2 levels inside of a beaver den. The first level is going to be basically like a mud room. It's usually kind of wet there. And then the second level is basically your pantry and your bedroom all at once. So that's where you store your vegetation throughout the winter. It's also where you and your kits are all going to snuggle together all day long and take your sleeps. And then you can be active all night long. So beaver dens are built to help make sure that you are as isolated from the edge of that waterway as much as possible. Another way that you're going to keep yourself safe in there is by having these underwater entrances. Underwater entrances, usually there's 2 of them, help to make sure that most of your predators, which are terrestrial, are going to not come inside and invade you while you are sleeping. Okay, could you go to the next one? So the other structure that they build are dams. Dams are going to be solid structures, and there's actually a lot of thought that goes into beaver dams, at least it seems that way. When we are working with beaver dams, we'll often find that the base will have a foundation of larger rocks, sometimes even boulders that have been moved in there, and usually larger sticks or maybe a log that has been felled in that direction. And then there will be layers of mud and then smaller sticks on top of that. There's lots of variations on that, but it's surprising how often we find rocks and mud as the base of this structure. And the purpose of building this dam is not just to make this cool structure, it's also to make sure that there's more water for beavers to be able to submerge in and keep themselves safe. They are only going to be able to escape predation if they are underwater or at least mostly submerged by water. So making sure they have some body of water deep enough to do that is a great tactic of keeping yourself alive. There's some other benefits to this too. Beavers somewhat act like farmers. So the species of plants that they like eating most are going to thrive in a beaver pond. And the larger that beaver pond might be, the more there is to eat. So a lot of those hardwood species that like to have wet feet, like willow and alder, cottonwood, those are all species that are going to do really well in an area that's going to have soggy ground. So having that beaver pond is one way to help make that work. This also is not the only benefit of building this dam. This will also saturate all of the surrounding soil. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And that's going to make it easier for all of these beavers to cut channels into the waterway, into the wet soil that surrounds the beaver pond. So essentially, they're making themselves a highway system that goes even beyond the margins of that beaver pond so that they can get even further into the wooded areas around the pond. So all of these structures together are working to make sure that beavers are kept alive and they're getting to the food that they treasure most. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the effects of all of this building. While we know that beavers are not looking out for us and not looking out for our landscape, there's so many positive benefits that we get to appreciate by beavers building these structures. So let's go through a couple of them. First, we know that having more water on the landscape means that we are going to benefit from just having more riparian vegetation. So riparian means the zone of vegetation, trees and grasses and reeds that are all around a waterway, whether it's a stream, a pond, or a lake. So that riparian zone is going to thrive with the presence of more water kept on the landscape. We also know that when more water is kept in one place, that water will seep into the soil next to where that pond might be. And as water seeps into the soil, then it's going to recharge that groundwater. Groundwater is something that changes periodically throughout the seasons, and if you keep water levels high, it means that there's always going to be water available for that riparian vegetation, so keeping it alive. So having groundwater stores is like an investment in that vegetation and helping to make it easier for not just plants, but the animals that subsist on those plants to stay on that landscape. Next, we also know that having beavers building dams and making these beaver ponds is going to improve water quality and water clarity. So one of the things that happens when water stays in one place, and slows down, is that all of that coarse sediment can have time to kind of filter through the water column and then land on the bed of that beaver pond. And sometimes it's that coarse sediment, other times it could be pollutants, maybe it's excess agricultural runoff. All kinds of heavy metals can be found that basically trapped inside of the goop that's at the bottom of a beaver pond. So beaver ponds essentially can act like filters and can bioretain all of those materials that we'd like to keep out of our waterways. And then finally, one of my favorite studies comes out of the Methow, which looks at water temperature and how beaver ponds and beaver dams affect water temperatures. One of the things that I'm most excited about is how beavers and salmon are going to benefit from each other's presence. So this study was looking at how when you have a beaver pond on the landscape and you measure the temperature of the water in the beaver pond, and then you compare that temperature to another body of water that would be nearby or downstream of that same area, maybe in the hottest part of the summer, you'll find that water that is in a beaver pond will be 3 degrees Celsius colder than water that is flowing across that landscape at the same time. And 3 degrees Celsius doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're a salmonid, having those 3 degrees is everything. Those species are so temperature sensitive that you need to make sure that there's these cold water refugias to keep those salmon healthy. Okay. Thanks. So let's go through some of the ways that we see the hydrology and geology of water, of how water moves across the landscape when beavers are present. So we're going to go through a series of images that comes from a study that was published by Michael Pollock. This was from a study in 2014. He's a researcher at NOAA, and he's an expert in this field. And so the first part, it's kind of hard to tell, but I will kind of demonstrate, I'll kind of walk you through what this image is trying to display, even though it's real bright right here. So this image is showing you first a very incised stream. We have really steep stream banks, and we have a stream that's basically a chute. So water is really just going down a straight channel. And beavers have built in this image a couple of dams, and it's holding back a little bit of water, but for the most part, there's not a lot of change in the channel yet. So this is an example of what happens when beavers are first brought onto a damaged landscape, or maybe an area where beavers have not been for quite a while. One more thing about this image that I'd like you to imagine, since you can't really see, is that there is a cartooned blue line showing you where the groundwater level is when beavers are first brought onto the landscape, and it's really low. It's right at the surface level of this stream. So having such a low such a low water table means that the vegetation that's going to be a little bit higher in elevation isn't able to reach that. And so there's a couple of examples of trees that are not doing very well. So when beavers are allowed to stay on the landscape for maybe a couple of years, you'll start to see some slow changes to the landscape. First, as beaver dams are built and then fail every time there's a big storm, every time maybe a young beaver builds a faulty dam, then some of the remnants of that dam are benefiting the landscape. So because sediment will build up behind beaver dams, when those dams are blown through, there's still going to be some pockets of areas where sediment is making like a little island that water has to flow around. This has happened repeatedly, so now we have some changes to the channel of the stream. We have some meanders that are starting to develop. And those meanders don't just mean that the water channel looks different, it also means that the velocity of the water is starting to change. You have some areas that are a little slower, some areas that are a little faster, and that means that the bed of that stream will change as well. Areas that are a little faster will be a little gravelier. Areas that are a little slower will be a little muddier. And that's going to be benefiting different species of fish and different benthic organisms that are at the bottom of the stream. All right, would you go to the next one? Thanks. All right, given a few years of beaver presence, we see even more changes. As beavers build more dams and more dams fail, then we'll start to see that that sediment builds up and is pushed around in a way that allows for the stream to start to branch and come back together. So you'll have these islands that will start to develop in streams and rivers that will add to more complexity of the hydrology of the system. You'll start to see that some of that sediment has been there for so long and has started to dry out just a bit to allow for woody species to start germinating, growing, and maturing. We also see that there's going to be some areas where some species are going to create little complex colonies, little micro-habitats of other aquatic species. And slowly, this whole channel is widening and making this previous cliffside of our stream bed to be a little bit more gradual, make it a little bit easier for animals to get from the stream bed back up into this terrestrial landscape, and also just have this gradual change in how seeds and plants might move across the landscape as well. All right, so given maybe a decade of beaver presence, you hopefully will start to see areas where beaver dams are becoming persistent over many, many years. Maybe you have ponds that are staying in place and that are being maintained by generations of beavers. And you might also have little islands that have mature trees now that didn't have them before. We'll also see that the groundwater has raised significantly. So now all the vegetation on the side of this wetland system is starting to be able to thrive year-round, where maybe previously things would start to die back in the heat of summer. And ideally, if beavers are allowed to stay on the landscape for multiple decades, we'll have this complex braided system where you don't have a single channel of a stream or a river. Instead, you have all kinds of different micro channels and rivulets. You have ponds, you have areas of high flow, areas of low flow, and you have a super high water table to complete it all. So having these very complex systems are a benefit not just for beavers, because they can move about their landscape without fear of being predated, but also for all of the vegetation, for all of those aquatic organisms, for the mammals, birds, and insects that are all depending on all of this complexity as well. Okay. So, in general, we know that when we see beavers on the landscape, they're going to help make sure that water is slowed. So velocity is minimized. And we also know that by minimizing velocity, that more water can permeate into the soil that's on the side of the waterways, allow for vegetation to mature and become more complex, and make sure that that sediment is trapped so that we don't have to worry so much about pollutants and coarse debris that might be flowing downstream and making things rough for the fish species that might be occupying that waterway. All right, so the next thing that I would like to talk about is not just how beavers affect the landscape, but also how they make that landscape fire resilient. One of the researchers that I think is just amazing in this field is Emily Fairfax. And Emily Fairfax has done a lot of great work in California. She's also been looking at beavers in Montana more recently. And she has made a lot of great discoveries about how beavers have created a landscape that's basically impervious to fires. So this is one of those examples. We've had super fires that we've had talked about for many years, and now suddenly the super fires that we had 5 years ago are tiny compared to the super fires of more recently. And so these super or mega fires are taking over entire watersheds, multiple watersheds, in ways that we would have never imagined 10 years ago. But in areas where beavers have made their home, sometimes those beaver landscapes, I don't want to say beaver complexes, but where beaver families of beavers have colonized, can essentially work like a fire break. That wasn't quite the case here. You can see that there's been burn on this mountain side of this mountain range and on this side of the mountain range as well. So both sides of the valley has been burned, but there's a stripe of green down the middle of this river valley where beavers have been able to create a refuge for animals and the vegetation that was not touched by that fire. And we've seen this happen not just in Idaho, but we know in Oregon and in California and in parts of Colorado, beavers have been able to essentially save parts of their landscape by being able to persist on that landscape for multiple years. So I'd like to shift a little bit away from the benefits of beavers in the landscape, and instead let's talk about how we interact with beavers. So beavers are just this amazing thing that you can see in almost any landscape you travel to. You can see beavers on this island. You can see beavers when you go to urban landscapes. You can see beavers when you're going into forested landscapes. They are everywhere. But they also can cause some conflicts. And here in my agency, in the Department of Fish and Wildlife, we get a lot of calls about beavers. It's the species that we get the most calls for, aside from deer. And because of that, we wanted to at least spread the message that there are ways that you can work with beavers to make sure that both you and beavers can coexist on that same piece of property. So one of our favorite ways of making sure that beavers and landowners can coexist is by using a mitigation technique of just putting fencing around trees. Fences around trees can be really effective at making sure that beavers don't chop down that tree. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. You have to use actual fencing, so chicken wire is just not strong enough. You need to make sure that fencing is strong enough so that a beaver is not able to just pull it down. And you need to make sure that the bottom is kind of buried a little bit in the soil so that the beavers don't just lift it up and chew right through that tree anyway. This middle image is showing us a beaver deceiver. Beaver deceivers are basically a metal barrier to help make sure that beavers don't build dams directly in front of a culvert. And then if you have a pond, and that pond is okay in general, but occasionally it floods your basement or floods your driveway, we can use a device that's called a pond leveler. And a pond leveler is essentially a drain. That drain is placed in such a way that it keeps the pond at the ideal level or below. So you want to make sure that that beaver pond is going to stay on the landscape. You're getting all of those environmental benefits from beavers being present, but you don't want to have all this infrastructure issues that you might be having before that point. So this drain is placed through the dam. We put the sticks back over it, so we're hoping that the beavers don't notice that we've been there. And then you need to make sure that the intake of that drain is placed within a cage. Now we're placing the drain inside of a cage for a couple of different reasons. First, we want to make sure that kits don't get sucked into this drain. Nobody wants baby beavers to be traumatized. But we also want to make sure that the beavers don't notice that water is entering into this pipe. Beavers are very sensitive to the sound of water moving. And if they hear water moving, it drives them crazy, and they have to build something to make it all stop. And so if you don't have this intake of the drain placed inside of a structure to hold it in one place and at exactly the right angle, it'll start to make a gurgling noise, and then you'll have a new dam built around this structure, making your problems worse. So this kind of structure, like a beaver pond leveler or a beaver deceiver, or even advice on how to put this fencing around your trees in the most efficient way, are all things that you can do yourself. There's a lot of instructions online, but it can also be daunting. And so one organization, a nonprofit called Beavers Northwest, is the organization that we refer landowners to the most. They're happy to give you advice for free over the phone, but they can also come out and do this work for you on your landscape if you have these issues. So please let me know if you'd like more contact information from them. They are a great resource. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the program that I oversee, the Beaver Relocation Program, because we have learned a lot about moving beavers around on the landscape. And this is a program that we are hoping to take from from pilot into a permanent program in the next couple of months to hopefully make this a law and make this program a part of DFW for the future. So we don't want to relocate any old beaver. We want to make sure that mitigation and coexistence methods are always used first. But there are some cases where those coexistence strategies, for whatever reason, fail. And when that happens, we want to make sure that there is an alternative for landowners to not go directly to lethal removal. Lethal removal is a thing that has to happen in some cases, but we love it when there's this other option of moving a beaver into a landscape where they might be able to thrive and do some good. So this is the only program of its kind in the country, and we're still learning a lot about it, but this is a citizen-run program. The department that I am a part of does not do relocations ourselves. We instead train other folks, citizens like you, to move beavers around on the landscape. And so we have a number of people here in the state of Washington that are trained through two different parts of training, which I'll talk about in a second, to be able to keep beavers temporarily in whatever facility works for them, and then select a release site so that that beaver can go thrive somewhere else. We have not built this program alone. We've had a lot of collaborators. So the Beaver Relocation Permit Program was first begun by the Mentau Beaver Project and the Tulalip tribes working in collaboration with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The Tulalip tribes has been moving beavers around the landscape for time immemorial, and the Mentau Beaver Project has also been moving beavers around in the Mentau for since about 2008, if I remember correctly. So there's been a lot of beaver movement from both of these organizations, and we're really grateful for their expertise to help us make this program successful. But we've also had a lot of advice from Beavers Northwest and Trout Unlimited, and also our wildlife services folks who are doing that good work of moving beavers around as well. And we are working with the Washington State University to be able to learn more about beavers on the landscape and translocating them and how that might affect populations and ecology. So let's talk a little bit about what our new relocators learn. They learn a little bit about setting traps, about animal husbandry, care of those beavers while they're kept in captivity, a little bit about how to be able to assess a habitat if it's going to be a release site. We'll learn about rules and regulations, some of the issues with conflict and landowners, and then conservation in general in Washington State. And trainings are open to anyone. If you want to learn these things, you're absolutely welcome to come. Trainings come in 2 different parts, and our relocators are required to complete both parts. But if you're just excited about this stuff, you can do either one of them. So we have an online training that allows you to learn a little bit about each one of these topics, and an in-person training so that you have hands-on experience setting traps and working with beavers. One of the requirements is that you need to have a holding facility of some form. Now this is an example of one of our fanciest. This is a unused salmon run in a hatchery over in Winthrop. Next time you're in Winthrop, go over to the federal hatchery. It's fun. There's almost always a beaver in there if you're going during the summer. But this is one of our fanciest ones. We also have relocators that picked up some dog crates that they got from Costco the week before. And as long as we work with them to make sure that it's meeting our 49-step criteria, then that works just as well. These are very temporary. We don't want beavers to be kept in captivity for very long. We want beavers to be taken from the release site and moved to their new site, or taken from their capture site and moved to their release site as quickly as possible to relieve as much stress as possible from the animal. So how do we select a release site? We use some GIS tools first to be able to figure out where beavers might do best. We have a model that was built by Ben Dipbrenner that looks at each and every stream reach here in Washington State, and using some very coarse tools looking at topography, we're able to assess the size of the watershed, how quickly water might be moving through that particular stream reach, and how persistent water is in that particular stream reach. And by looking at these 3 different metrics, each stream reach is given a score between 0 and 3. So 0 is unsuitable, and that's represented as blue in this map. But any area that's yellow, orange, or red is suitable in some way. Red is our most suitable type of habitat, and that is a good indicator of places where our relocators should go visit in person and see if it really is as good as our model suggests. That release site is then assessed in person to see if there might be cattle that are in the waterway. That's usually an indicator that it's not a good release site. We also will look to see if beavers already are in that spot, and maybe we want to make sure that there's no predators around. So looking for scat from either cougars or bobcat or bear will also tell us that's not a good place for beavers to be relocated. So by looking at a couple of different options, then we can filter out the places that we know are definitely not a good option and look at some finer details about that habitat. How much forage material is available? what does the stream bank look like? What's the substrate of that stream? And by looking at all of these different options and by giving each one of them a level of scoring, then we can add it all up and figure out if that site is really a good match or not. So another aspect of the program is that we're working with WSU to learn more about beavers and beaver relocation. So one of the things that we are curious about and a little anxious about is what happens when you move beavers around the landscape and there might be pathogens associated with that population. Maybe there's invasive species that are in that trapped location that we don't want to be moved to the second location. How does that move when beavers are translocated? So we're working with the lab. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but we're excited to learn more, and that will be publicly available when it is. So by working with our permittees, then we have a better source of material to be able to send to this lab. So we have some fur samples that we've been sending to that lab to help learn more about how pathogens and fungal spores move about with beaver pelts. And a couple of other details about what changes on the landscape when beavers are moved around. Okay, so we have a couple of beaver relocators in the state. We don't have anybody up here yet, but there's a possibility we might have one soon. So our beaver relocation training program starts in the spring, and our relocation period, our season, starts in March. So if we do have anyone that's available in this county, I'll certainly let you know. It'll also be available on our beaver relocation website. So if that ever comes up, or if you know anybody who's interested in joining the program, please let me know and we'll get you connected. So if you don't want to have beavers in your backyard, can you help? Absolutely. We use data from iNaturalist to be able to learn more about beavers and where they are in the state. And iNaturalist, if you're not familiar, is a website or an app that allows you to help identify what species you're looking at when you're out on a hike or you're wandering around your backyard. You can take a picture of something, tell the app what the location might be, and experts or other naturalists will help you identify it. But it will also be a way for you to be able to report what beaver sign you see. And that's something that we can help use to figure out where beavers are in the landscape. All right, so folks, I am excited for any questions that you might have for me. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm excited to stay around and make sure all of your questions are answered.
What do you know about how many beavers we have on Orcas and where they are and how they got here?
Yeah, all great questions. We know very, very little. We know that there are beavers here. Actually, I just was hanging out with Megan today looking at a couple of beaver complexes that are down that direction of the island. And to be honest, we don't know how many beavers there are anywhere. We don't know how many beavers there are in the state. We don't know how beavers got here. We do know that beavers are migrating from other land masses to get here. And it's a weird thing to do. Beavers should not be in salt water. Beavers that spend too much time in salt water will perish from saline poisoning. So it's a bad idea. But we know that beavers are coming here. And one of those reasons might be that there's so many beavers on the mainland that as beavers produce more beavers, they're really good at that, and they kick out their young, usually around late spring, early summer. Those teenagers might be coming here because there's just no available habitat on the mainland. But it also might be that habitat is being degraded or developed on the mainland, and maybe beavers that have been established there for many years suddenly need to find a new place. So we're not quite sure why beavers come here. We're not quite sure how many beavers are already here. We know there's not very many, but we're excited to learn more. And so we are arguing for funding to have a population study over the next year or two. We've got a long way to go with that, but hoping for the best.
Does somebody in the room know where they are?
I know where some are. Our place.
Awesome, yeah. Well,
Valley Creek.
and iNaturalist, if people enter data in public places too, that's another place to look at where beavers might be. So, yeah, chat more, figure out where they are.
So,
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Is there, the different populations that are on the island, are they interrelated or are they independent populations? Do they come from different, are they expanding here or are they coming in migrating?
That's a great question. I don't know for sure. My suspect would be is both. So beavers reproduce a lot. Beavers in a really good year can produce up to 8 kits if things are going really well. And beaver kids will stay with their parents for up to 2 years, but there's a lot of variation before they get kicked out. So you can have a lot of beavers in a 2-year period, and they need some place to go after they get to be teenaged. So that's probably one element that's happening. The amount of beavers that are produced by a pair is really dependent on nutrition and weather conditions. So if things are going really well, if you have a mild winter, have a good summer, then you can definitely have a lot of beavers, and those could be just disseminated away from wherever they are right now to new locations. But beavers are certainly migrating here as well. I talked yesterday at the San Juan Island, saying that they had a beaver that they didn't know any beavers were on the landscape before. Suddenly there's a beaver that showed up like a year or two ago in this new location. And it had to come from somewhere, and most likely came from other land masses. So we really don't know much about why they do that, or how many they are, or how many are already here. But it's just rough when you're trying to study an animal that doesn't have a neck that will allow you to put a GPS collar on it. So they just slide right off. But it is a great question. I'd love to know more.
Hey Shawn,
Yes.
there's a place to report to you, to DFW, correct? If people have sightings out on the land?
Yeah, we used to have an incidental beaver sighting form, and you're absolutely welcome to give me a call or email me and let me know that you found a beaver. Even just text me that you found a beaver. That's something I'd like to know. But we also have found that using iNaturalist has been a really reliable way of getting the data we're looking for too. So just location alone is super helpful. So yeah, thanks. I wish we had that incidental form. Yeah.
When you go to relocate them, how much land do they need to expand into?
Great question. We ask that our relocators evaluate 2,000 feet upstream and 2,000 feet downstream of that relocation site. So conditions must be met for various parts of that evaluation in that 4,000 foot reach, basically. Great question. Yeah.
What's the average lifespan of a beaver?
Great question. It really depends on where that beaver is. Kept in captivity, a beaver could last for about 14 or 15 years. But outside of captivity, beavers typically are about 8 or 10 years old maximum. There's, of course, a lot of variables for that and some outliers too. Yeah.
Is it true that they used to be diurnal and became nocturnal because of human influence, or is that not true?
Yeah, it is partially true. So there are some beaver colonies that are in Seattle where beavers are active during the day and tend to sleep during the night. And we don't know if it's because of human activity or because there's no carnivores nearby, so there's no longer a fear of being predated upon in that really urban location. Good question. But typically when I'm going into areas that are suburban or rural, then I'll still see that there's patterns of being more nocturnal than not. Yeah, but we'll see how things change over time. I mean, it might be carnivore pressure, might be human pressure, mix of both. Yeah.
Does beaver age affect their behavior at all? If we have like a bunch of young beavers on the island, would they be like doing different landscape modifications than older beavers?
Yeah, great question. Yes, teenage beavers make all kinds of terrible decisions. They will build beaver dams in ditches. You'll see them in like weird agricultural ponds. All of their structures, when you see a teenage beaver structure, it just looks like a mess. And you can tell right away that they don't know what they're doing. So yeah, it's definitely weird. And usually when teenage beavers are doing things, they're doing things alone. It's not usually, well, sometimes this happens earlier, but they're still looking for mates when they're about 2 or 3. And then eventually, once they're working together, then they kind of figure things out. But yeah, a lot of really bad choices in general for those young beavers. Yeah.
When I read novels, I read about everybody wearing beaver hats. And I always thought they were the tall hats. You didn't show the tall hats. They're not the tall hats that like Lincoln wore.
Yeah, you know, they were. And it kind of depends on the era. And I'm sorry, I think my image was from an advertisement of one particular era instead of the entire breadth of when it was popular to wear beaver hats. But yeah, those super tall hats, like the Lincoln stovepipe hat, that was typically made of beaver hide or beaver fur, just like you were suggesting. But there was a lot of trends too. So sometimes you had these weird designs that maybe haven't really persisted into like our films and art and such. But there was a lot. Beaver hats were popular for so long that we just had a lot of variability on that.
They were exported a lot to China, actually, the pelts. They were very popular in China.
Yeah.
That was a big business.
Still are.
So-
A lot of pelts currently. Like a lot of our trappers here in Washington State sell directly to Chinese and Russian importers. So, yeah, just different cultures. Yeah.
You obviously are interested in beavers. So what do you think their IQ is? Do you think they're really smart? And aesthetic? Have you ever seen that? I once was canoeing on a lake, and I went through this little passage, and I found this whole world that looked like it was landscaped within an inch of its life by incredibly smart aliens, and it was beavers.
That's amazing. I look at that little brain case from that skull, and it's just not very big. But I think that they are very evolutionarily smart. So there has been so much evolutionary time that's been put into this species that allows them to make the choices that they make. And because they also have these tight familial ties, there's a lot of knowledge that gets passed down from parents to offspring. And I think that that's incredibly powerful because there are very few species that have so much technique that they depend on. So I think in that way, they are very smart. They are able to show their offspring ways of being able to manipulate the landscape to ensure survival and being able to ensure thriving to their offspring. And I think that is very smart. Individuals, maybe, it's tough. It's tough to evaluate a single individual. Yeah.
My sister and brother-in-law have a pond that beavers have moved in, and they like to swim in the pond. What do you do with beavers if you're swimming?
Oh, great question. One thing to keep in mind, there's only been one death of by beavers, and it was because of a guy had accidentally kicked a beaver. So don't kick beavers. Otherwise, you're good to go. Also, probably wouldn't be a great idea to maybe inhale or take too much of that water into your mouth, but just for pathogen reasons. But otherwise, if the beavers are tolerating their presence,
That's why I was wondering, do they get aggressive?
if you try to handle a beaver, they're not thrilled about it. They might have some things to say, but they're certainly not going to injure you unless things get really, really worrisome. You'd have to do a lot to make a beaver want to bite you or scratch you. In general, I think it wouldn't be the worst. In general, with wildlife, it's best to give as much space as possible, but you gotta swim. I love swimming. I can't wait to go swimming tomorrow morning. Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much. As long as the beavers are not showing signs of being, that you're affecting their behaviors, I think it should be okay. I guess it depends on how big that beaver pond is too. Yeah, interesting. Well, good for them. Yeah.
Speaking of the size of the ponds, how many dens would a pond support? Would a pond support more than one?
Yeah, great question. So I thought up until last October, I would have told you yes. And pretty much any other beaver scientist would tell you that as well.
Yes, they would support more than one?
No, sorry, that they would have a single beaver per beaver pond.
Okay.
Because they are so territorial. They
Right.
just wouldn't tolerate more than one beaver around. But I went to a beaver pond, retention pond really, in Yakima. And it was a very dry summer last year. And I thought that there wouldn't be a lot of beaver activity. And lo and behold, there were 3 different bank dens that were all in the same tiny retention pond, and they were coexisting and building. And typically beavers are going to be, familial based. So maybe they were all related, but once you get to a certain age, they still don't really tolerate their presence of their offspring for too long. So I was very surprised to see this, and it's been something that all of the beaver community is kind of excited about. So when times are tight and things are droughty, then a single pond might be able to support more than one den, familial unit at a time. So I wouldn't say that is possible west of the Cascades, but definitely east of the Cascades, that's what I observed, and that was kind of exciting. Yeah.
Do beavers have any other symbiotic relationships with like other land animals and such?
Yeah, they totally do. So you'll find lots of bird species are really excited about beaver dens. They'll nest on top of it. But mammal species, muskrats are really excited about living in the same den as beavers. We've seen pictures of them like cuddling up together during the winter, which is really weird. And while beavers and otters maybe aren't the best of friends, they will definitely have higher populations of otters when beavers are present. Same with mink. A lot of those mustelid species really do well when there's more water on the landscape in general. More water means more insects. More insects means more small mammals. Mustelids love eating small mammals, so that works out really well for everybody. Those are probably the species we see the most of that are not directly predating the beavers. So those populations kind of explode when beaver populations expand too. So yeah, it's pretty cool seeing the diversity that improves. And you go to like any of these websites. Beavers Northwest is one of these. The Mentau Beaver Project will show you camera trap footage of all the species that show up when beavers are brought to a landscape that hasn't had beavers in a long time. There's lots of really cute pictures. So. Oh yeah.
What's for one, thank you.
Oh yeah,
Great
absolutely.
presentation.
Thanks.
What is the mating relationship like? Are they monogamous? Do they mate for life? And what's
Both.
That?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. They will quickly pick up another mate if something terrible happens to one of them. But up until that point, they will stick with one mate for life or until something terrible happens. So, and it's incredible watching them work together. It's just very touching seeing a mated pair work together over weeks and days to be able to make a structure together. So it's very much an equal partnership. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, what, like in Washington State or in the West, what are the politics around beavers? I'm thinking about like wolves or something, where there's these clear factions. I'm sure some people want to catch beavers, some people are annoyed that they're flooding their lawns.
Yes.
Is it like all over the place, or how would you briefly summarize like the greater population's feeling about the beavers?
Let me just say, this has been talking on the islands And folks on the west side of the Cascades is like the highlight of my life. Talking to other populations, it's not quite as friendly as this group, so thanks a lot for that. I deal a lot with folks that are recreational trappers, and that is a population that is a part of my constituents. I need to pay attention to their needs as well, and trying to talk with those folks, and when they're using the same landscape as relocators, making sure that everyone's communicating is a really tough spot to be in. We also have a lot of folks that have agricultural lands. Beavers cause a lot of problems for agriculturalists, and we need to be sensitive to that too. We would like to know how many beavers agriculturalists are taking off of their lands. We're working to make slight changes just so that we have a number to be able to report, because when you're taking beavers off your land lethally, and that's something that does need to happen sometimes, we just want to know about it. Oregon just passed a new law that you have to report this and get a permit. We don't want to have a permit, we just want to know a number. So that's another conversation. A lot of people are worried about how beavers are affecting salmon in negative ways. We have a lot of publications that say that beavers positively affect salmon. And pond levelers are one way to help make sure that beavers continue to help salmon in the spots that they have chosen. There's a lot of pushback against salmon and beaver mitigation structures, and whether beavers should be on the landscape at all, depending on where you are. A lot of people are angry about flooding. Yeah, that makes sense. I would be angry about flooding too. It's really strangely complex out there. But I get to hear about all of it. It is a really interesting job. I'm very lucky.
I've heard a little story. There's a book here in the library. It's called Beaverland, and it's brand new. You know the story about the little lady who had beavers as pets. It's like this. She had like a whole family of pet beavers, and she ate with them. They sat on the table with this woman. You read the story, right?
Oh man, yeah, and Instagram knows me, and they send me all the pictures of beavers that are building dams with stuffed animals and teddy bears. I'm just so precious. But no, please don't keep beavers in your home. Really rather that didn't happen. Oh man, can I take a few more? Would you? Okay, great. Yeah.
I just had a question about your model and kind of the bounds of beaver territory. Is there a way to predict if a watershed is big enough to hold? We don't have that many miles of stream in the islands, but is there a way to predict how many beavers we have capacity for?
Yeah, great question. So, just as an aside, that GIS model that I showed up here, available to absolutely anybody. You just got to send me an email. I'll make sure that you understand how the BIP was built, and you can have that map and play around with it. Just send me an email. I'll get you that connection. But yeah, the way that the model was built is very coarse. So we're looking essentially at elevation for each one of those pixels that make up the landscape. And because those pixels are so coarse, I think it's 30 meters pixels, we only know so much. So the values that are scored here are basically looking at how much elevation is around each one of these reaches, and is the elevation of the reach itself such that water velocity is too much, and is there a large enough space that is being drained that water can be there mostly year-round. So there's a lot of other things that are not going to be raster based that will affect all of those variables, and so that's why we can't just find this on the map and be like, yep, beavers are there. So we have to go down in person and be able to verify that. And that takes a lot of time. And so, especially on the islands, we were looking at San Juan Island yesterday. We're like, look at all of these beautiful places, these stream reaches. And like models are great at telling you like ideal situations and really bad at being accurate. And this is no exception. Like it has a lot of hope to it, but there's definitely going to be places where it's just not enough water year-round. It also is built on models that could be up to 20 or 30 years old, and our precipitation models are not the same. We are seeing that we have rain at the wrong times. We're seeing really heavy storm events. We're seeing longer drought periods. Our summers are longer and weirder than they've ever been. Our summers are hotter than they've ever been. So there's a lot of issues. But based on the data that the best data that we could find, I can find it. Ben Debrunner found. This is as good as we've got. But yeah, there's definitely a lot to parse out. Maybe somebody should do a master's project on that. I don't know, just saying.
Yeah. Just to add to that, where are you getting the digital elevation models from? Is it DNR LiDAR? Or?
I think so. Email me, and I'll send you a report and connect you with Ben, and you guys can chat about that all year round. He's really fun. He knows a lot. Oh yeah.
So as far as riparian restoration, I know a lot of planting projects are done with species like willow that, are not very quote unquote beaver resistant.
Yes.
And that's not an issue for us necessarily because we don't have a large population of beaver, but in some of these cases, like willow is the only plant that is successful in fully upgraded sites.
Yeah.
But how do
you plant willow but also prepare for the inevitable beaver?
Yeah, I know there's riparian restoration programs in Oregon that, have separate lists for beaver-resistant species that you could plant in riparian corridors and that sort of thing. And ultimately, having beaver would be better for the riparian system in general, but kind of the coexistence of you need to plant natives to restore habitat, but if beaver is introduced, then it's kind of,
Yeah, it's such a weird balance, right?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. When you're restoring a riparian space, there are some species that beavers will avoid. Nine bark is one of them. There's a couple others. But there were some species that we saw today that I saw beaver marks on, and I had never seen a beaver eat rose before, and there it was. So yeah, there's always, unique tastes out there, I guess. But my first advice is just plant 5 times more than you think you will possibly ever want. Willow especially, cottonwood especially, they're just going to chow it down. And then there is just remembering that beavers are going to be way better at restoring that than we ever will be. And while you may not want beavers to be there initially, there are folks that I get calls from people on the peninsula. They're like, we're restoring the habitat. We just brought in the bulldozer, and now we have a beaver, and it just chewed down all 100 of our willow. And I was like, you brought in a bulldozer in a riparian space. Well, yeah, so it really is trying to figure out what works best. Sometimes fencing is a way to go about it. There is no perfect solution. I wish I had one for you. But, beavers will come eventually. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question on the opposite end of that.
Yeah.
Is a monocrop of willow enough to support a beaver population?
If you ask any beaver I know, absolutely, they're all about it. But really what will happen is that they'll chew down all of that willow, and then as they're building, then other aquatic vegetation species will start to come in. They love water lilies, they love rhizomes, they'll eat irises, they'll eat a lot of invasive species, surprisingly, depending on where they're at. So you just gotta build and cross your fingers, plant all of the willows, and hope for the best. Yeah.
No, actually.
Oh, we're at time.
Yeah, we're at time.
Man. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, folks, thanks so much. Thanks for that. I have cards on here if you'd like to get in touch.
I've seen that on Stuart.
Remember, if you would like to join our trainings just for the fun of it, it's a beaver party. If you would like to have access to our maps or our model, you're welcome to that. If you want to ask how to keep beavers away from your property or attract them to your property, I'll do my best to advise on both ends of the spectrum. Come get my cards, and thanks so much for coming.